Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dawn Goley, the Director of the Marine Mammal Education and Research Program here at Cal Poly Humboldt. And I'm really honored to be among such a diverse group of stewards, and in particular, in the original stewards of this land, the Wiyot. We understand the role that burning fossil fuels has had on terrestrial environments, everything from increased heat waves to increased storms. But I want to just emphasize that it had had profound impacts on the marine environment as well. And I want to just bring up a few marine mammal examples because, you know, that's kind of what I do. But the polar bears are obviously impacted by the lessening sea ice and reduced food and shifting diets and decreasing populations. On the upper right, you see gray whales, which are just finished an unusual mortality event that also had to do with reduced food up in their feeding areas. Down here, elephant seals along here and elsewhere in their range, which are impacted by sea level rise during particularly vulnerable times of their life cycle, where these babies are sometimes ripped away from their moms, ripped away, come on, taken by the sea. And then finally, California sea lions, which also underwent an unusual mortality event because of a heat wave in the ocean, which reduced productivity out there. So marine mammals are impacted by global climate change as well. Oops. And through this conference, I've seen that there are projections and tracking of impacts of climate change in Humboldt Bay as well, including what a warming bay and increased sea level rise will do. Alternative energy, such as offshore wind, has obviously potential long-term benefits that Arnie went through beautifully today, but decreases the dependence on fossil fuels, limits impacts of climate change. But there are potential short-term costs, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. Negative impacts to local communities, environments, wildlife during implementation and operation. And the goal is obviously to balance that out so that the benefits of the whole thing outweigh the costs. So the goal of my talk today is just to consider kind of a slice of pie that we might not have talked about yet at this meeting. And those are the nearshore and inshore marine mammals, and how to include them in these early discussions of offshore wind development in Humboldt County. And I'm going to focus on harbor seals, but I probably will throw a couple others in. And I want to describe how the natural history and ecology and space needs of harbor seals might overlap with potential wind development. And then at the end, suggest potential ways to minimize the impacts of offshore wind. So I kind of modified this from the Shad's slide, thanks Arnie, but I wanted to show you, you've seen this slide before, the proposed offshore wind, again, no decisions have been made, but the proposed offshore wind has 4 components. And we've heard a lot from Arnie about this electric transmission part, and we've just heard some wonderful talks from Stephanie and Ben and others about the offshore wind part. And so a lot of the focus actually has been on potential impacts of wind energy to offshore or pelagic whales and seabirds for good reason. But some animals that may have not been in the conversation as much are these nearshore and inshore marine mammals. And so I'd like to sort of talk about them for the next part of my talk. Nearshore marine mammals include not only harbor seals, but gray whales. And we've been studying gray whales here since 1997. There are around 1,700 gray whales that migrate near shore during the spring and winter migration, and that's April through May. You can see them offshore right now, and then back in December to January. And there's another small group of gray whales that live here in the summertime and feed in summer here instead of going up to the Arctic feeding grounds. Their diet is benthic or in the substrate, or epibenthic just above, or pelagic prey. And the potential impacts to them as they migrate quite close to the bay, where increasing vessel traffic is predicted to occur, would be ship strikes and potential entanglement due to increased vessel traffic. And there is a knowledge gap here about the pattern of travel in and around Humboldt Bay and the timing of travel, and that would be something that would be worthy of investigation. The animals I'm going to talk about today are these guys. Harbor seals, the latest estimate of the number of harbor seals in California is around 27,000, 27 to 30,000, but just note that that was in 2012. That was the last NOAA surveys that were done here. They are year-round residents of nearshore waters and Humboldt Bay. And I'm going to emphasize the significance of them being nearshore residents and that they live here and have relatively small home ranges. They're dependent on these local habitats. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And they're generalist feeders. They feed on everything that's here, fish and cephalopods for the most part. The potential impacts that have been suggested for seals include low frequency noise that is within their range of hearing, vessel disturbance, vessel strikes, and habitat and or prey disturbance. And the knowledge gaps we have about these guys, although they're so common in the bay and we all feel as though we know them well, is that we don't really know what their population size is right now. There's some potential that the population sizes are decreasing. We don't really understand the temporal and spatial use of Humboldt Bay right now. We don't have a recent idea of what their diets are and the overall health of these animals that are living within the bay that we've all come to know so well. So, why harbor seals? Harbor seals are fairly common. They live in a wide range in the world, and they are always resident and always non-migratory. Their distribution, as you can see here, overlaps pretty strongly with where some wind energy areas have been proposed elsewhere. And there have been some protocols for study established, yet as we've heard from Stephanie and Ben and others, the sites really do differ in relation to the inshore habitat and the offshore habitat, the prey communities, competition with other seals, type of offshore wind, and the distance of turbines from shore. And so while we have some indication of some of the impacts, it will likely be very different out here. So why do we care about harbor seals other than they're amazing? They play a critical role in the ecology of the bay. They're one of the top predators in the bay. Generalist predators typically stabilize a diverse prey community, so they play a huge ecological role. They're a key role in nutrient cycling, and that's basically they eat stuff away from there or deep, and then they bring it up and poop it out, and that's a great way to cycle nutrients. They're long-lived, 25, 30 years old, and they have high site fidelities. They are considered to be indicators of marine environmental health, and that they're kind of like a sponge where they soak up the good and the bad of the environment around them, the prey, as well as the contaminants, as well as the pathogens. So harbor seals in Humboldt Bay, we'll zoom in a little bit more. There's about 1,000 year-round residents from our last surveys. They depend on these beautiful mudflats in North and South Humboldt Bay to rest or haul out. They give birth on these mudflats, and they molt. And harbor seals are like other true seals in that they have a catastrophic molt. So during that time, which up here is around July, they tend to haul out for longer periods of time, and more of them seem to come to Humboldt Bay to do just that. So that period of time is really important, and giving birth happens around now. April-ish is the sort of peak month, and that's a critical time for them in our bay as well. They also depend on the nearshore and inshore waters. And in the bay, they depend on the waters of the bay for safe travel between bays and within the bay, for feeding. Some of them stay in the bay the entire time. And for breeding, and it's kind of odd, but male harbor seals do what's called lekking behavior. And so the way that they attract mates is to make noise under the water by the haulouts. The females swim by and they select the haulouts and the males based on their underwater vocalizations. And so acoustics play a large, isn't that wild? Yeah, you can talk about it at dinner. People will be impressed. So it just goes to show you that acoustics do play a large role in their life and their life history. They also depend on nearshore and potentially offshore waters for feeding, and that means that you have 1,000 seals that as their haulouts go away and the mud goes away, a large proportion of them are zipping out of the bay to go to the grocery store and then coming back. Yeah, so you have a lot of movement in and out of the bay of these seals. Thank you. So home ranges and core feeding areas of tagged harbor seals. This was a study we did a long time ago. These are a couple females. Yes, you capture them and put radio telemetry buoys on their head so that you can track their movements. And this was a female that was tagged in South Humboldt Bay. The dark green areas are where they spent most of their time. And you can see this female spent most of her time in South Humboldt Bay, but did go somewhat offshore to forage. And you can see this female spent time in South Humboldt Bay, but then spent a lot of time in North Humboldt Bay. So she stayed mostly in the bay itself. So the structure of proposed offshore wind, again, 20 or so miles offshore. We don't have any indication that our seals have gone out there, but it was 20-year ago technology, so it wasn't the best. So they may go out there. But the one thing I want to draw your attention to is what's happening inshore. And so I know that Rob will talk to you later about this, but part of what's going to happen in the North Bay is proposed to have a sort of wind terminal to sort of help support the offshore components. And that could potentially is in the North Bay corridor where seals are going back and forth. And I'm not going to dwell on that. So the potential impacts of offshore wind energy development on harbor seals, and these are not just my ideas, these are ones that have been proposed by others. There could be no impact. Harbor seals could be just fine, right? There could be beneficial impacts. It could be that the offshore wind is this wonderful ecosystem that harbor seals are drawn to. But the potential negative impacts that have been proposed include sound from ships or construction could injure or displace seals. Increased vessel traffic, which we've heard different concerns about the increased vessel traffic, could impede movement into and out of the bay and within the bay. And it may restrict access to foraging, breeding, birthing, and resting sites. There's a higher potential for ship strikes just because there'll be more ships. There's a potential increase in the stress response and decreased overall health of the seals. There's potential reduction in reproductive success, and potentially a subsequent loss in ecosystem services. So the ways to minimize those impacts include near and shore marine mammals and early environmental assessment discussions with agencies, developers, and coastal stewards. And I have to say, I've had wonderful discussions with different managers and the offshore and inshore developers. But I think the most important thing is to answer the question, what is normal for a blank, right? And this blank, I'm going to say, we're going to put harbor seals in that blank. But we have to understand what is normal for these animals before construction begins. That includes what's the population size, what's the reproductive success, what's the temporal and spatial habitat use, how do they move about the area, and what is their health, which again is reflective of ecosystem health. And I propose that collaboratively developing and standardizing protocols along the West Coast community, which includes partners of local tribes, government agencies, leaseholders, the harbor district, is pretty much the way to move forward. And that's why I'm proposing or letting you know about harbor seals in the bay today. We want to consider the timing of the process. You know, the first things that need to happen is to have the infrastructure built before we can sort of manage the offshore part. And that has a shorter time frame than having fully operational offshore wind turbines. So I want you to think about this little tiny slice of the process, which is near shore and inshore. And I want you to think about the temporal slice of that process too. And we'll need some time, or not we, but they'll need time to sort of do those baseline studies so we can get a really good understanding of the role that this top carnivore and indicator marine health is playing. So now as before, it's important to build baseline assessment of harbor seal population size, ecology, health in Humboldt Bay before the construction begins. To identify, this way we can identify potential overlapping concerns during these baseline studies and work together to minimize potential harm to local communities of animals in the near term during infrastructure development and operation of offshore wind, and to maximize the potential benefits of reducing these impacts of climate change because of the use of alternative energy. And with that, I just wanted to say how honored I feel to be with such a diverse group of people that are all studying different aspects of Humboldt Bay. And I look forward to us working together in the future to sort of really understand the entire ecosystem as we move forward. And thank you for your kind attention.